I answered a query the other day about Leopard 38s and their seaworthiness, and it got me thinking about a trip I'd done from Hong Kong to Seychelles. From photographs I found out it was 2010. It was a Leopard 38 that had been at the Hong Kong boat show. I'd flown in from Belize accompanied by crew Peter and Vernon, who'd done a 7,000-mile Cape Town to Belize trip with me on a Leopard 38. 56 days of glorious weather, lots of fish, nice steady winds, not even a bad rain squall, the kind of passage that happens once in a blue moon. It was late November, end of cyclone season. The northeast monsoons had not yet set in. The winds were still very north but unstable, and the forecast was for northerly flow veering to northeast. Now, it's roughly 1,500 miles to Singapore from Hong Kong. If we departed in the first week of December, we could dive due south, aiming for a waypoint between Vietnam and Spratly Islands, at which time the wind should veer northeast. We'd change course with it, keep the winds astern, and be a straight shot into Singapore Straits, up the Malacca Straits, and our first planned stop was going to be Langkawi. That was the grand plan. But as with all good plans, sometimes they go belly up. The boat had flat batteries, electrical, mechanical issues. Finding a decent technician in Tien Mun is like looking for the proverbial needle. We ended up departing 3 weeks late. The first 3 days was 30 knots behind, 3-meter seas, very regular, nothing out of the ordinary. The autopilot developed a gremlin. By this time the seas were 30, gusting 40. The seas had built to 3 to 4 meters. 2 a.m. while charging batteries, the starboard engines abruptly stopped. Now, I've carried a spotlight all over the world with me, and this was the first time it actually got put to use. And there, trailing out behind us, was a long dark shadow. Clipped on, hung off the stern, desperately groped with a boat hook, and snagged what I naively thought was going to be seaweed. And to my surprise, we pulled on board a 3-inch braided ship's mooring line. It was 40 meters long, if not more, and once we had called it in the cockpit, we still were stuck with the issue that it was stuck in the starboard propeller. Simple plan: engage astern, start the engine, spit it out. And surprisingly, it worked. But now we were hand steering as the autopilot was no longer reliable. It's 40 gusting 50. The seas have built to sustained 4 meters and occasionally a 5-meter height. Now, hand steering in these conditions is always good for crew starting out, but it requires rolling watches. One person on the helm, one resting on standby, and one attempting to sleep. I took up station on the cabin sole, where I had direct line of sight to the helm station. In the morning during my off watch, I cut up the 40mm preventer as we had no use for it. The main was most certainly not going to be used in these conditions, and my intention was to tow this rope behind us as a drogue. So I braided the 40mm line into the mooring line. It was around midday. I was on the helm. The crew were finishing off their coffee. They were getting all booted and suited, getting their harnesses on in preparation for deploying the drogue. The first sense I got that things were going to be interesting was when the seas dramatically increased in height. They were suddenly 6 to 8 meters, possibly more. We were doing sustained surfs of 16 to 18 knots. Now bear in mind, we've got no sails up. This is bare poles. There was a sound like an approaching freight train. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the cockpit fill up with white water. White water doesn't concern me too much, as it's comprised of mostly foam. I stopped looking at the log when we passed through 20 knots. The noise during these surfs is unbelievable. It's a long drawn out rumbling, lots of vibrations. It almost drowns out the shrieking of the wind. On the third wave, the boat pitched down quite dramatically. I could see along the side decks. The bow was buried deep into green water, and the rudders were no longer responding. My thoughts were, so this is what a pitch pole is going to look like. Out of nowhere we got hit from the side, the boat leveled out, and we dropped free fall into the valley between two massive waves. The impact at the bottom made my knees bend. The mast took up a similar angle. I thought it was going to break, but it shook, shivered, and stayed upright. That's when the crew appeared with eyes the size of dinner plates. They'd been thrown around the inside of the cabin, but to give them their credit, although they were shaken up, they were all geared up and ready to go. Now the drogue had been rigged. I'd fed the lines around to the cleats port and starboard on the stern of the boat, and I'd flaked the line down on the cabin's or the cockpit sole, ready for deploying. The crew were needed to actually feed them around the diesel drums on its way out. The moment it hit the water, it snapped into shape. The boat speed came down to a steady 4-5 knots, and occasionally we'd surge to the 9s. Typical ocean waves traveling at about 15 knots. If you can get your boat speed down that or below that, you're going to control the speed, and you're not going to do those nerve-wrenching, out of control surfs down the front of them. In this relative calm, I managed to fix the autopilot. We stayed on the rolling watches. I think it was around Christmas Day when the conditions moderated and we managed to deploy a little bit of foresail for the first time in over a week. We got the fishing lines out. Within minutes we hooked a fish, and we had a really decent lunch with all the Christmas decorations. One would think the story ends there. I decided that we would stop at the Royal Singapore Yacht Club for a little bit of personal recovery, and the boat had some serious issues that needed addressing. Now the Singapore Straits are hectic. Fortunately, I've done it before, but this time we were coming in at night. No radar, no AIS, just eyeballs version 1. Halfway through the entry, Vernon was hyperventilating so loudly I thought we had developed an engine issue. By hugging the channel markers, we avoided the majority of the inshore traffic, and being just outside the main channel, we avoided the big traffic in it. It's still quite something to be in such close proximity to these huge vessels. You get up to 3, maybe 4 boat lengths alongside them. We docked at the Royal Singapore Yacht Club, and as the last line was cleated off, hundreds of lanterns took to the sky, and that's when I realized it was midnight, 31st of December 2010. It was a trio of very tired but happy campers who collapsed into their bunks that night. You would think I would sleep late. Sunrise found me in the engine bays, staring at the steering, trying to figure out what was bothering me. There are no straight edges down there, and I was convinced the tiller arms were either out of alignment or bent. The factory in Cape Town was in December shutdown. Operations said, fix it, keep moving. So I took photographs. When I downloaded them onto my laptop, my blood just ran cold, and even sitting here 10 years later talking about it, the hairs on my arms are standing up straight. Not only were the tiller arms bent, several welds had broken, and there were striation cracks about 90% through where they'd bent the tiller arms to shape. How much more punishment could they have handled before failure? Who knows? I don't want to lose steering in a catamaran in those big seas and winds. The outcome would most certainly not be pretty. After a call to operations, they stripped a boat in Cape Town of its tiller arms and they carried it off to Singapore. What did I learn from this? Shit happens real quick. Boats can take a lot more than you think. You need to be self-sufficient out there. Think ahead. Be prepared for the worst. Hope it never happens. And you need to learn to sail in boisterous conditions before you get into them. One would think the story ends there, but the balance of this voyage from Singapore to Seychelles is a tale for another day.